Welcome guys to the first episode of learning how to read Yu-Gi-Oh cards. So this episode will be understanding when is an appropriate time to actually start a chain link and what the different sections of a card means. This video is targeted for beginners, not so much for intermediate players, but maybe you learn something along this video. So we'll be looking at cards such as Sangan and then understanding what the effect actually means, and hopefully throughout this you'll learn how to read cards that are a bit more harder, such as Nightmare Unicorn, and then hopefully something as horribly terrific as Small World, which is quite a card. So, in this episode, we'll be looking at the difference between a condition, an activation, and what actually happens afterwards when this resolves. So, these are examples taken out of the official Yu-Gi-Oh! Rulebook. As here you can see, there is a text example. I'll be highlighting them in the different colors. So colons will always be written in green, semicolons are always written in red, and then what happens when the effect resolves is in blue. So the first thing we have to understand is the difference between a monster with colon and semicolon and a monster without. So Sangan, we can see here, for example, it says here, when this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, colon, add one monster with 1500 or less attack from the deck to the hand. So what a colon and a semicolon essentially mean is it opens up the link for your opponent to chain. Now, Cyber Dragon, for example, what he says is, if your opponent controls a monster, you can special summon this card from the hand. There's no colon, there's no semicolon, so your opponent can't even chain to it. So that's also very important to know, is when you're playing duels, where are you allowed to chain to and where not, because there are certain monster effects that don't have a colon or a semicolon, so the link never opens, so you're not able to chain. That's just very, very important to understand before we move on with the other examples. So firstly, we are going to be looking at condition. So what even is a condition? So everything in front of a colon, double dot, is a condition. So here it says, when this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, colon, add one monster with 1500 or less attack from your deck to your hand. So this is essentially the condition. A colon is always seen as a condition, something that has to be true at activation only. So let's say I do this and my opponent then goes, oh no, I don't want you to have your effect. I'm going to remove him from your graveyard and shuffle him back into the deck, or move him from the graveyard into the discard pile. Now, that doesn't matter because it only has to be true at activation. So if he is moved from the field to the graveyard and my opponent chains to move him from the graveyard, it doesn't apply anymore. I still get the effect off of it. And that's very important to know. There are certain cards that will say this card has to remain in the graveyard for the effect to resolve, but that will be a text at the bottom of the card, like the last sentence, just so it's clear. But in general, the condition only has to be true at resolution, and afterwards it doesn't matter. So again, if there is a colon, it opens it up for your opponent, but the condition just stays true throughout the point that she activated and afterwards not. So what your opponent can do, however, is he can chain to the actual effect. So add one monster from the deck to the hand. So there your opponent can ash that. Usually the only things that can be affected is the effect itself, not the condition. So now, what even is an activation? So the difference between a condition and activation is, an activation is usually seen as a cost. So this is something that you have to play first before your opponent can chain to it. So here the card says discard one card to target one card on the field. effect, destroy it. So we can see here's a semicolon, it opens up for a chain. Basically what it says is that I first have to discard a card and then target. And then once my opponent knows what I'm targeting, he can then chain to it. And after his chain resolves, then my chain resolves. So I discard the card, target one, my opponent chains whatever he wants to, and then afterwards when it's passed back to me, I could destroy whatever I targeted. So that's just important to understand that if there's a condition at the front, do the condition, move on to the activation, wait for your opponent to reply, and then move forward with the actual resolution and the effect, what it tells you then to do. So in this case, it's just to destroy. So we will then move on to understanding. So what you have to understand is you first have to make sure that the green part is true, so everything before the colon. So if the card says you have to control 3 light monsters before you can use the effect, make sure that you are controlling 3 light monsters before you can actually move on to activating the card. And then do the part in red. So if it tells you to pay something, discard something, do that first, and then allow your opponent to react to it. So here I put together a 3 little chain example. So let's say player 1 plays Trident Warrior, and it says when this card is normal summoned, colon, you can special summon 1 level 3 monster from your hand. So this actually means he normal summoned this monster, it opens the link, so my opponent chains to it. So player 2 plays Rageki's Break, and he wants to target one of player 1's cards. So the first thing he has to do is discard a card to target 1 card on the field, and then this opens up again because it's a semicolon, opening the link for the second time, and it says then destroy. So player 1 responds then with Gemini Spark. And this is basically how this goes back and forth. So if we were to look at it this way, if my opponent were to chain with a card that did not have a colon or a semicolon, I couldn't even react to it because that's when the chain actually ends. There's no opening, so I can't even chain onto it. So if we take this example, we'll see how this actually then plays out. So here on the right hand side we see how the situation would play out, and on the left hand side we can see the situation that was set up. So again, we're going to be using the colors to understand it a bit more. So we go through from the beginning. So he starts the chain but doesn't do the effect until the whole chain resolves, since it resolves backwards. So player 2, what he does is this point he has discarded the 1 card and targeted player 1's monster. So we go back to player 1, and what he does is tribute his monster and targets one of player 2's cards. So that's basically Gemini Spark, which says tribute 1 face-up level 4 Gemini monster you control to target 1 card on the field. So tributes the monster, targets, and we move on. So now the chain actually resolves because that was the last action played. So Gemini Sparks goes first, it destroys it and draws 1 card, and then we move on to the second card that was played and destroys it. The monster isn't on the field anymore, so nothing happens, the target is gone, the card basically just goes to the graveyard. And then we go on to the first card that was played. He gets a special summon, the 1 level 3 monster from the hand. So this is just for us to understand I'm allowed to chain. What can I even chain to? And what can I do during this chain to stop my opponent from activating his effects? So we'll be talking about targets on the field in a little bit, just so you can understand what actually happens when targets move or disappear. Here are things that to take away is just understand that costs are always paid at activation. If the card tells you to pay or discard, tribute, destroy, you just have to do that before allowing your opponent to link to it, and if they don't chain to it at all, then you just move on with the resolution. Again, if there's a colon or a semicolon on a monster or a continuous spell trap, that means a chain starts. So again, if there isn't a colon or a semicolon, you cannot chain to it. The link never opens, so you can't chain towards it. Also, any activation conditions written before the colon, this is colon specific, not semicolon, colon specific. It only has to be met at activation. If something changes, it doesn't matter unless the card specifically tells you, hey, I have to be on field for you to be able to use my effect. The colon and semicolon cannot be affected by chain, and you can only target the resolution. Now, here we'll be looking at that in the next video, because there are tiny little loopholes where you can actually affect the semicolon. The colon can never be affected, but the semicolon can be affected, but we'll get into that in a later video. Now it's just understanding where you can even chain. Zombie monsters, this is also something that I just wanted to point out, is the last sentence. It says, this monster must be face up on the field to activate and to resolve its effect. Again, usually colon is never affected unless the card specifically tells you, I have to be at this point on the field for this effect to resolve. That's just important to know. So here we'll be looking at a few examples. I have the effect written on top, and then underneath I explain the separate parts. So the first part, the condition, everything before the colon, says, if you control a face-up spellcaster type monster, colon, target one monster, semicolon, tribute it, then special summon one spellcaster type monster from your hand, then you can destroy one monster on the field. Alright, so if we break this down, so the spellcaster requirement is before the colon, so you only need a spellcaster type monster when you activate this card, not when it resolves. Again, if they chain link, move something, doesn't matter. It was there at the point of activation, and it's just tough luck. If they misplayed, they misplayed. But that's also good for you to know, because if you move something in front of the colon and it still goes through, that's why. You have to know these things. So the semicolon tells us the only thing you do at the activation is to target a monster. So there it says target one monster, so we know, alright, we target, we let the opponent know, so the opponent can chain to it, and if they don't, then we just move on. So it says here, you tribute the monster at resolution, then do the other effects. If the monster wasn't around for you to tribute at resolution, then you don't get the effect. So again, if I want to tribute that monster and my opponent goes, no, you're not doing that, I'm shuffling it back into the deck or I'm putting it into the graveyard, then it's not on the field anymore and you cannot tribute it, so the whole card basically just loses its entire effect. So let's say my opponent doesn't chain to it. Alright, you tribute, then summon, then destroy if you want. So it has to be exactly in that order. So the last thing that happens is that you destroy, and if you don't destroy, then the last thing that happens is you summoned. So then is always kind of like well, you can then, if you want to, destroy a monster on the field, but you don't necessarily have to, because I don't know, maybe you just don't want to. Maybe you're a nice guy and go like, oh no, it's fine, keep your monster, it's alright. But again, these words, these keywords we'll be looking a little bit deeper into in the next episode. Right now, we're just really focusing on understanding when you can chain and what you can chain to. Now this card, Blade Knight, says, while you have one or fewer cards in hand, this card gains 400 attack. If this is the only monster you control, negate the effects of flip effect monsters, it destroys by battle. So if we look at this, there is no colon or semicolon, so the link never opens. Your opponent cannot chain to this. So no colon, no semicolon, no chain. So this is basically a card that you can just attack and your opponent just has to deal with it. There's nothing that they can do. Again, that's also important to understand if you're playing against somebody and you're not 100% sure, because people don't read card text and say colon and semicolon because it's not something that that's told. This is not common knowledge. Usually you just play and you just play back and forth because you know certain things you can link to and certain things you can't link to, but this is just important to know that if there is no colon or semicolon, you can't even chain. You can end a chain with this card. That you can do. If my opponent does something and I chain a monster effect that has no colon or semicolon, it's just tough luck for them. That's how you actually stop a chain. That's also something that not everybody knows. So here, Kinetic Soldier. Alright, so he says, during damage calculation, if this card battles a warrior type monster, this card gains 2000 attack and defense during the damage calculation only. Would you look at that? There is a colon. So, hey, Divine Wrath incoming. My opponent will just hit me with that card and it's over. The other card I was safe, but this card I'm not safe. So that's also, that's also something important to know, is when you play cards that have an opening for a chain, you just have to be ready that they can chain to it and they will chain to it. So you just have to know, if my opponent does chain, what can I do in response? And if they end with a card where you can't even chain, well, hey, then they just outsmarted you with that one. But I'm pretty sure they learned a little tip from me. But yeah, we'll be moving on. So the last card that we're going to be looking at is once per turn, you can detach one XYZ material from this card to target one face-up card your opponent controls, semicolon, destroy it. So this is something that is super important to understand. So let's say I target the card and my opponent decides to move it around. So if he flips it from face up to face down, it's still targeted. If he moves it from his side of the field to my side of the field, it's still targeted. If he moves it from the monster zone to the spell trap zone, it's still targeted. The only time it's not targeted is if it leaves the field. If he removes the monster and shuffles it back into the deck, puts it in the graveyard, puts it into the discard pile, it's not on the field anymore, so it's not targeted. And that's also very, very important to understand, is when the card is no longer on the field, it is no longer targeted. As long as it's on the field, no matter which position it's in or where it is on the board, as long as it's on the board, it's still targetable. That's also something that is very important to understand. Alright, so this here is basically the cheat sheet. This is what you can take with you. If everything else didn't really matter to you, at least this, screenshot it, save it, write it down. This is what's going to help you through your games in the future. So here it just says costs are always paid at activation. If the card tells you to pay, discard, tribute, or destroy in the activation text before the colon or semicolon, it is a cost. Now what we have to understand between a cost and a target is costs cannot be altered by chains. So if my opponent again chains and does something to alter the cost, it doesn't matter. It went through at activation. If before the semicolon it says discard one card and target, the target can be affected by a chain. So targets and resolutions, the blue text, anything after a colon or semicolon, can be affected. The only thing in front of a semicolon that can be affected is the target itself, because the target is not a cost. That's important to understand. That's a big thing that really stands out. So target is not in my control anymore. I didn't have to it's not a cost. I can't pay that. It's just I targeted and my opponent can and most probably will do something to affect it. So again, semicolons can actually be seen as costs. It's easier to understand, and a colon is just the condition. So it's the condition that it's under. So also a colon and semicolon on a monster or a continuous spell trap means a chain starts. It's basically like a little cut in the link where the person can start chaining things onto it. As long as there's a colon and a semicolon, feel free to chain onto it, and then your opponent will chain, and then you can go and chain, and just continue with it until you kind of run out of ideas. But also important to understand is any activation conditions written before the colon must be met when you activate the card. If something changes before the card resolves and the conditions aren't met anymore, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. That's the main difference between the colon and the semicolon. Colon cannot be affected, and the semicolon, the only thing that can be affected is the target. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this video and you learned a little bit about the difference in how to read cards and how to react to them. In my next video, I will be talking about the keywords in cards and how this actually affects the strength of the cards, if you want to look at it that way. It really shows where some cards aren't even as powerful as they may have seemed in the beginning. Anyways, guys, thank you so much. I love you lots, and I will catch you in the next video. Alright.